everyone, welcome to our new topic of fungi. Fungi are a special group of organisms. They are something that actually used to be in the plant kingdom. We used to think that fungus and plant was the same thing, but they're not. They are now their own kingdom. This is a kingdom of eukaryotic and mostly multicellular organisms. Now, by eukaryotic, I mean that they have complex cells. That's what eukaryotic means. They have things like nucleus, cell membrane, cell wall, lots of different organelles inside of their cells that have a lot of different functions. And multicellular means they are mostly made of more than one cell. They are, like I said, used to be considered plants, but we've determined that fungi do not make their own energy. They are heterotrophic. They must consume something else in order to survive and do their metabolism. Now, some are parasites and some have different ways that they get their energy, but most of them are decomposers. You've heard of fungi decomposing things. They digest material that's actually outside of their body and then they absorb it. So here's how that all happens. They actually release like a liquid chemical outside of their bodies that lands on some material that they want to digest, and that the enzymes in that liquid will break down that material and then they'll absorb that liquid, and that's how they eat. It's kind of ugh, but that's how fungi do it. They do have cell walls, just like plants have cell walls, except in plants, the cell walls were made of cellulose. And in fungus, the cell walls are made of chitin, which is a type of carbohydrate. Most of them are sessile, which means that they do not move, though some of them are motile and able to move. They move with a flagella. We'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the chytrid fungus. Both sexual and asexual reproduction is possible in fungi, and again, we'll talk about that as well. A lot of fungi do reproduce sexually, though some, like yeast, that are single cellular will reproduce asexually. So let's take a look at more fungus. So this is the kind of type of familiar type of fungus that you've seen probably outside, like a mushroom. Now, sometimes people will like kick this part of the mushroom, and when they do, they're actually releasing the mushroom spores into the environment. So you can see that top part of the mushroom is where the spores are made and produced. So if you kick that part, you're releasing mushroom spores and helping it reproduce. Kind of interesting. They also have not quite roots, but root-looking structures called mycelium. You could see them possibly if you were to dig up a mushroom, but they are not roots in the same way that plants have roots because they just aren't used for the same purposes of getting water for photosynthesis. Don't do that. Anyway, mushrooms are kind of interesting, and let's talk about different types of fungi. There are about 5 different phyla of fungus. Now, if you remember back when we talked about the animal kingdom, we talked about different phyla like sponges, roundworms, flatworms, echinoderms. Those were all different phyla of the animal kingdom. Fungi have different phyla too. They have common molds, which is like ones you see on bread and fruit and vegetables, food that's been left for too long. You see fungus growing on it. There are sac fungi. Now, a lot of the sac fungi are in that group that would be considered truffles. A lot of people go and hunt for truffles. It's considered a delicacy or a really nice food. You can sell it for a lot of money if you find truffles. But an unusual type of sac fungus is yeast, and yeast is used for making bread and even in like brewing productions. So we'll talk about yeast a little bit more in a second. There are also club fungi. Those are those ones that you see outside, like this, those mushrooms that you might have seen outside are an example of a club fungus. And that basically means groups of cells that get together and work together. And then you've seen imperfect fungi. If you've ever had ringworm or athlete's foot, you have experienced an imperfect fungus. And those are ones that are typically ones that infect human hosts, unfortunately. The last one we'll talk about is chytrid. Those are the ones that are actually motile. They're able to swim using their flagella, which is like a tail. And they are usually going to infect amphibians like frogs and salamanders. Let's talk a little bit more about these different ones. So, common molds. They, like I said, are the ones that are on your bread, your fruit, your vegetables, something that's been left in the refrigerator or on your countertop for too long. If you see common mold growing on your food, you probably don't want to eat it. It is not usually safe to eat anymore. What's happening is that a fungus has been growing on and digesting that food material, and it's kind of cool to look at it. It's usually fuzzy, it's kind of interesting, but you don't want to eat it. If you've ever seen truffles, this is somebody who's been harvesting truffles. There are actually people who train pigs and dogs to smell for truffles so that they could harvest them and then actually sell them for a lot of money. If you've seen that, you've seen sac fungi. There are many different types of sac fungi. You could have seen them out and about. But an unusual type of sac fungus is yeast. And yeast, you can see here, is single cellular, and you can actually see that it does asexual reproduction. It buds, which means that a new cell grows off of a pre existing cell. Now, yeast does fermentation, which, if you remember back when we were talking about the cellular respiration process, if you don't have enough oxygen, you're going to do fermentation, and yeast does alcohol fermentation. So it's often used when baking bread or even in the brewing process because of that fermentation that it does. You may have seen it if you bought it at the store in a jar like this. Next, you've got club fungi. Those are mushrooms like you might have seen outside, or a fungus that you might have seen growing on a fallen log. Club fungi actually are able to come in many different shapes and colors and sizes. They're a really diverse phyla of the fungus kingdom, but they all have this in common. They kind of have a top where the spores are going to be produced at the top of those club fungi. You can see that. Again, if you kick over a mushroom, you're basically helping it release its spores and reproduce. Kind of interesting. It's usually also the part that if you eat mushrooms, like portobello mushrooms, you're eating a club fungus. All right, this one is the one people don't like to talk about because imperfect fungi, which you can see under the microscope, have kind of an interesting shape, which is how they get their name. Those are typically parasitic or disease-causing type of fungus. It requires a host to live on. If you've ever been to the doctor and they said you have ringworm and you had a mark on your body that looks like this, kind of a raised circle, then you didn't have an actual worm in your body. So don't worry about that. But you did have imperfect fungi under your skin. Another example of imperfect fungus is athlete's foot, which you can see here. That's really common and easy to catch in places like locker rooms where it's cool and it's damp, and you might accidentally have gone barefoot. So wear your shower shoes if you're going in the locker room. All right, last type is the chytrid. This is a frog who has unfortunately passed away due to the chytrid fungus. This is the one where the spores, which you can see here, microscopic spores actually have flagella or a little tail, and that helps them swim and better infect their host. So chytrid fungus is a type of fungus that actually has affected frogs and salamanders and other types of amphibians, and doctors and scientists around the world are looking for ways to prevent and cure chytrid fungus. Last but not least, just in case you want to check and make sure you remember the important parts about fungus, what kind of cells do they have? They have eukaryotic complex cells, and they're mostly multicellular. How do they obtain nutrients? Well, they're heterotrophs, which means they get their nutrients from something else. And most of them are decomposers, which actually release kind of a fluid and break down some material and absorb that nutrients. So decomposers. And then what are fungi cell walls made of? They do have cell walls. They're made of a carbohydrate that is called chitin, Chitin, chitin. All right. Thank you so much for listening.